Okay, I can see your screen. Perfect. Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for spending your Tuesday morning with Louise and I. So I'm Tina Beaird. I am the owner of Tamarack Genealogy. I am also a local history and genealogy librarian at the Plainfield Public Library. I have been there for 16 years. I have done numerous digitization projects, both large and small. So hopefully the information that I provide for you today is going to give you a little bit of my experience, my insight in starting that process. Over the years, the further I get in my digitization career, the more I realize that if I have the ability to outsource, it's the best thing for me. So I'm going to give you some examples of things to do in-house, and then I'm going to give you some examples of vendors who do some great digitization work to whom you could outsource your information to as well. So now, for those of you just getting started, oh, okay, why is it not advancing? Well, I guess we're not going anywhere just yet if I can't get it to advance. There we go. Okay. So before you begin, whether you're outsourcing, whether you're doing the work in-house, the most important thing that you could do, your number one priority, is to figure out exactly how many items, how many volumes, how many pages of newspapers you're looking to digitize. So when you start talking to companies, whether it's a company that is going to sell you software or a company who's going to sell you a scanner, you want to know exactly what you have. How many pages do you have, by issue? Is your average newspaper issue 28 pages long? How many pages does that equate to per month? And then what does that give you per year? Does your newspaper have special sections, quarterly for spring or summer or fall? You want to take all of that into account. You want to factor in whether or not you're digitizing from microfilm or whether or not you're going to be digitizing original copies. The library has done both. We've done original copies as well as microfilm, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, what the advantages are to that. One of the things you want to figure out, who's going to do the work. Are you going to have it done in-house, or are you going to have it done through a third-party vendor? And then who is your audience? What is the reason why you're digitizing these items? Are you doing it for preservation? Are you doing it for ease of access? Because that's really going to affect how and why and where you put things online. So if you're going to be doing the scanning yourself, if you're going to be handling that process in-house, these are the types of things that you want to consider. So you're going to want to assess your needs. You're going to want to make sure that you create a budget in advance. Once you've created your budget and you've assessed your needs, then you're going to go through the process of actually buying the equipment. And once you have the equipment in hand, then you're going to set up a test batch or a test run to set your baseline standards. How long does it take you per image? How many people have to touch each product? So you're setting your timeline for your project going forward. So now if you're assessing your needs, how many items, how many pages do you plan on scanning? That exact count is imperative to doing your research. What is the paper size? Is it going to fit on a purchasable flatbed scanner? Is it 11 by 7? Is it 12 by 18? You need to figure out exactly what the page size is. And you need to figure out what type of binding it is. Are you going to be digitizing newspapers that are already pre-bound? So you're going to have to worry about the gutter or the margin. Are you scanning from microfilm? Are you scanning from, individual loose sheets of paper? All of that is going to play into your decision of whether or not you're going to do that in-house or whether or not you're going to outsource that information. Another important question is, who's going to be doing the work? Is staff time going to be dedicated to it? If it's staff time, how many hours of staff time is going to be set aside each day or each week to complete the project? Are you using volunteers? Do you have a roster of volunteers already, or are you going to have to go out and find people who have those particular skills? When you're factoring in time, if you're doing scanning in-house, you always have to make sure that you double the amount of time that you set aside for scanning, for digitization work. And the reason being is because volunteers quit. People get sick. There are holidays that need to be accounted for. People want to take vacation. Even with staff, if you're doing it with staff hours, is it enough staff time per week to keep on track with what timeline you've set and made available? All of those things play an important part. So you might do your test run. you might see that it takes you a minute per scan and then 3 minutes for creating the metadata and doing the quality control. So you might say, okay, we've got 1,000 pages we want to digitize. We factor that out 8 hours per week. We'll be done within a year. Set aside at least 18 months. And the reason being is because you're going to probably have people take off 2 weeks at Christmas. You're going to have people take off at Thanksgiving. People are going to want to be off for the 4th of July, and they're going to want to take a vacation in the summer. You know, they're going to have kids that are homesick from school. So, you know, always make sure that you're setting aside plenty of time so you don't get 2 weeks from your deadline and you're scrambling because you still have, you know, 200 pages to finish. Your most important question, yes, it's important to know how many pages you're scanning. Yes, it's important to know who's going to be actually doing the work. But one thing to consider is, who is your audience? You know, is it going to be teachers and students from the local classroom? Is it going to be genealogists and local historians from around the country? Is it going to be people just within the library or your local government who need to access these so they can, you know, do their job, complete their job? Figuring out who your audience is what's going to allow you to decide how and where and why you make your collections available online. I'll talk about some companies at the end that provide online hosting for your newspaper collections, but do you want to host it in-house? Do you have the ability to put that up on your website? Do you have somebody to maintain it? I'll talk about that in a little bit. You know, are the people who are going to be using your items mostly people who can access that information in-house? So you don't need to worry about hosting it online. You can just host it on your local server and give people access to it. You know, what is the reasoning behind the project, and you know, what are your goals? What are your measurable goals? If you've ever applied for a grant, one of the questions that they always ask you is, how are you going to promote your project? And what are your measurable outcomes? How are you going to be able to deem whether or not your project is a success? So start thinking about what those measurable goals are. Are you going to have, you know, an increase of 10% usage to your website? Are you going to have an increase in local history genealogy questions? Are you going to have an increase in teacher school visits? What do you want to accomplish? What is your goal? And then once you know your audience and once you know what your goal is, then you're going to be able to fill in that gap in between and pick the correct resource and location for your project. I can't tell you enough how important budgeting is. Yeah, when you're writing a grant, and I write a lot of grants, I always tell people to overestimate, you know, over budget by 10%. And the reason for that is, if you're being grant funded, you never, ever, ever want to give money back. It looks very bad if you give money back at the end of a project. And the reason for that is because now the grant funder needs to find a way to spend that money. They had already allocated it. They had already taken it off their books. So if you come back and say, oh, we have $500 we didn't spend, then it causes problems for them in the long run. So always over budget, even by just 10%. And if that's the case, if you come in at your dollar amount, great. If you go slightly over, hopefully it's something that you can absorb into your local library's budget. But the question is, where's the money going to come from? You know, once you create your project and once you make it available online, you've spent the money, you've done the scanning, you've got it up. Do you have the money set aside to sustain it? Do you have the money set aside to keep it going in the long run? If you're using a third-party vendor who's hosting your collection, what are their fees going to be every year? And do their fees have a tendency to increase? You know, so those kind of things you have to make sure that you're continuing to budget in once your project is over. You know, are you going to need an IT person to handle it? Are you going to need to have more server equipment so that you can host it yourself? So you want to factor in all of those costs, not just the costs that are generated during the course of the project, but long-term costs for any future work going forward. Don't just buy online. In the Amazon age, we have a tendency to do our searching online and say, oh, well, I can buy a scanner on Amazon for $3,100. That could be great. They could advertise it as being 30% below market cost, but sometimes, occasionally, you can get a better deal by working directly with companies, working directly with vendors. So if you have a contract with Gaylord or you have a contract with Tiger Direct or somebody like that, you know, ask them, can you give me a better deal than what I'm seeing online? You know, can you cut me a better deal? Can you waive the shipping costs? Because when you're shipping equipment, when you're shipping scanners, when you're ordering scanners, the shipping costs can be quite substantial. So do some negotiations. I always joke, my father sold cars for 25 years, and I have, the negotiator deep in my bones. So I'm more than happy to call more than one company and say, what's the best deal you can give me? And play them against each other. Well, Best Buy said that they could give me this price. Can you do any better? And a lot of times they'll come back and they'll be willing to do that for you. So don't just buy the first product you see online. Contact the companies and see what they can offer you. So now what about that equipment? What about that software? If you're doing your digitization in-house, you're going to need to have some equipment. You're going to need to have some software. So PC Magazine just put out an article last month with their top 10 scanners for 2018. So I included that link in here for you to go and peruse and see what's out there. Make sure that you're picking a scanner large enough to handle your largest image. If you're doing a lot of 11 by 17 papers, but those special summer inserts are bigger, they're 12 by 18, or they might be even larger, then make sure you're buying a scanner large enough to be able to handle that work. I know people who have done newspaper scanning on home personal scanners, letter sized 8.5 by 11, and then they have to piece those issues together. Save yourself the hassle, save yourself the extra work, buy the biggest scanner that you have, that is available, that will fit your needs. And I will tell you, as somebody who has purchased scanners over the years, a ledger scanner, a typical flatbed ledger size scanner, 12 by 18, will run you about $3,000. So when you're looking online and you see these companies advertising scanners for $800, I would say be a little leery and check some other sources, because probably the best benchmark out there is about $3,000. Now, what type of software are you going to use? It's great for you to digitize the images and have the raw files, but what are you going to do with those raw files? Are you going to compile them into PDFs by date? Are you going to compile them into PDFs by month? Are you going to keep them as individual raw images page by page and numbering them that way? So you want to think about what your options are. So there are scanning softwares out there. My scanner uses what's called a Twain software package. It's Twain, just like the author, but my scanner's a bit older. Two of the best newer products that are available out there on the market right now are ViewScan or Rhetorish Pro. And basically what those do, those scanning softwares, and if you buy a scanner, typically it'll come with some type of scanner package in it. What that does for you is it allows you to crop. It allows you to fix the skew if the page is slightly crooked. It allows you to highlight certain sections and brighten or darken certain sections. So it gives you that ability to edit each individual image to make sure that you're getting the best quality scan that's available. But then on top of that, how are you going to make these scans accessible to the public? Are you going to use some type of OCR software? Are you going to use, the text reader packages? So Adobe Acrobat Pro allows you to do that. There's also Abby Fine Reader. They're both done by the same company. Each one has different advantages. If you're doing thousands of pages, then Abby Fine Reader has the ability to do more OCR technology, more text reading. But Adobe Acrobat Pro is fantastic if you're compressing single issues into one PDF. So you're taking 25 pages or 8 pages or 35 pages of images, JPEGs, TIFF files, and creating one individual PDF of it. And then you can run the OCR technology on that individual PDF. So it makes it completely text searchable. And then what are you going to do with the originals once you're done? How are you physically going to store the newspapers? Whether they're microfilm, do you have a place to store the microfilm once you're done? Or whether you're doing loose individual pages, do you have a way to physically store those loose pages once you're done? I've met some libraries who have, once they've digitized their papers, they've pitched them, and that could be an option for you. It makes me die a little inside as a local historian and as an archivist every time I hear somebody say that, but I've known plenty of libraries who have done that. But if you decide you're going to keep the original object, then you need to consider how you're going to store it and where you're going to store it. If you're going to encourage people to go to the digital product, then you don't necessarily need to have the originals available and on display any longer. So if you remove them from display within the collection, where can you put them? Do you have a space? Do you have a workroom? Do you have an office where you can then store these copies? And then not just physical storage, but digital storage as well. You know, does your library have a server that's big enough to host the original digital images? Are you going to purchase external drives? You know, how many external drives and what size? You can get an external drive up to 4 terabytes now for about $100, $120. You can get 1 terabyte of storage for about $80. It's worth it to have redundancy. So if you're going to scan your newspapers in-house and you're going to physically store the images and you're looking for a way to digitally store your images, don't just store them on your library server. Make sure that you have them secured in other potentially off-site locations as well. Because we've heard a lot about viruses, we've heard a lot about malware, and a lot about these companies that are hijacking libraries' computer systems and making you pay to get the information back. So at the very least, if you have it on an external device someplace else, heaven forbid, like the museum in Washington State last week that burnt to the ground, you know, you've got it off-site and you have it saved somewhere else. For those of you who think that USBs are appropriate storage devices, as an archivist, I'm going to tell you the USB device is like the brown paper sack of the archival world. It is designed to get your information from point A to point B. It is not designed for long-term storage. So even if you have a 128 gigabyte USB drive and you think that's great for storing your preservation, your images, your text, your newspapers, it is really only designed to be a carrying device to get your information from one place to another. It is easily corruptible, it is easily damaged, whereas external drives are better for long-term storage. So what about maintenance and IT? I'm lucky that at my library I have an IT department that can handle all of the crazy digitization and scanning problems that I have, and they're able to fix it. But what if you don't have a department? Then who can you rely on? Can you contract with the outsourced company that's doing the work? Can they give you a guarantee or a maintenance agreement? If you're doing it in-house, you know, make sure that you're keeping up on the warranties for your equipment. So when you buy your scanner, it typically comes with a 1-year warranty. I would highly advise you to have an extended 3- or 5-year warranty on that equipment, because if you don't have an internal IT department that can troubleshoot for you, then you're going to want to be able to rely on that backup, on that warranty that's provided from the company itself. You know, do you use Geek Squad? Do you use some other IT company that only comes in when there's a problem? If you have an internal IT department, are they going to be able to do the added work? You know, are they going to have to charge the library additional money for the extra hours that it's going to cost them to help maintain this new collection? So you're going to want to negotiate and make sure that the work that you're doing is covered under the current contract. And if it's not, you know, see what type of rate they're going to give you for any additional costs that are associated with that particular project. So when you're doing the scanning, what you're thinking of first and foremost is your upfront costs. How much is it going to cost me for the equipment? How much is it going to cost me to buy the software packages and things like that? But what I also want you to think about, again, are those long-term costs. So if you're having it hosted by an outside source, what are their setup fees? And I'll talk a little bit about setup fees when I talk about the individual companies. Those companies who are going to be hosting your images, you know, is it a flat platform fee? Or does that have a tendency to increase every year? And if it increases, what is the increase? Is it 3%? Is it 5%? So that you can make sure that going forward, you're factoring in those additional costs into your budgets in subsequent years. Are you paying staff? Are you paying volunteers to do this work? If so, is it just a short-term contract and as soon as the scanning is done, you're no longer going to be paying their salaries? Or are you paying salaries for them to continue to do work or maintenance or uploading or whatever type of back-end project work needs to be done? So what about copyright? There's a wonderful program that's coming up on July 17th. I highly recommend, if you guys have not signed up for it, that you take the opportunity to sign up for the Rails program that's going to be coming. My explanation of copyright is intentionally oversimplified because there is so much gray in the copyright world that's why an entire lecture is needed just on copyright. So the information I'm going to give you is just a very boiled down, oversimplified view of how copyright works, but I highly advise all of you who are considering doing a digitization project to listen in onto that copyright presentation because they're going to fill in a lot more of that gray area that I don't have time to talk about today. So,
and I'll just to jump in, sorry to interrupt,
please.
But I'm going to share a link in the chat to that, and then we are recording that day as well. So if you can't attend the live session, it'll be up on the Rails archive page.
Thank you, Louise.
Sure.
So, copyright standards, copyright guidelines. You know, every state, a lot of library systems, a lot of universities all have their own copyright statements, their own guidelines for how they utilize items within their collections, within their state, you know, online as well as in print. So one of the generic guidelines is that if an item is published before 1923, then it's available in the public domain. So if you've ever been online and you've been searching newspaper collections online, you'll notice that a lot of publications stop in 1923, and that's because that's when copyright kicks in. So if you're digitizing images, whether it's photographs, whether it's documents, or whether it's newspapers, if you're publishing, if those have been published before 1923, then you're going to have access to those. You're going to have the ability to republish and reprint those because they're going to be what's called in the public domain. There are exceptions to that. Companies that are still in existence, like the Chicago Tribune, my newspaper in Plainfield, the Plainfield Enterprise, is still in existence. So while the material before 1923 is accessible and available for you to use through public domain, even if that's available to you, I would still ask the owner's permission to make that available. Even though you don't have to, it still generates goodwill, and it looks good on your library's behalf that you're working with the copyright holders. So you're not just taking what's free. You might be able to negotiate past that 1923 date by talking with them in person. It's nice to send an email. It's great to make a phone call, but that in-person negotiation is always best when you're trying to get them to release their newspapers. So between 1923 and 1977, these items may be in the public domain, and this is where that gray area really starts to come into play. So if a newspaper had failed to renew their registration, so you would have to renew, in 1978, they had to renew their copyright registration. And if that newspaper failed to do that, then the information may be available in the public domain. If the newspaper failed to put a copyright statement in their newspaper, then it may be available through public domain. So it's a very gray area. So if you're looking at your newspapers from the 1930s and 1940s, and you're noticing that there's no copyright statement on the newspaper itself, and I would recommend going through a couple months worth of issues. Check the beginning of the year, check the end of the year, and see if there's no copyright statement on the newspaper, then it could very well be available within public domain. Even if they went into the Copyright Office and re-registered their copyright, if they did not put it on their publication, then it's potentially available for you to use within the public domain. If it's a paper that has subsequently gone out of business, it's now 2018, and that newspaper went out of existence in 1977. I'll give the Chicago Daily News as an example. Chicago Daily News folded in March of 1977. It closed its doors. A lot of the reporters from the Chicago Daily News went to work for the Chicago Tribune, but the rights to the paper were bought by the Chicago Sun-Times. The Chicago Sun-Times still owns the rights to those newspapers, even though the Chicago Sun-Times has subsequently been bought by the Chicago Tribune. The Chicago Tribune does not own the rights to the Chicago Daily News. They're still owned by the Chicago Sun-Times. So you have to figure out, you have to trace that copyright and figure out, did they get gobbled up by another newspaper, and is that newspaper still in business? You have to check through the Copyright Office, the Government Copyright Office. Did that newspaper that gobbled up that paper when it went out of business, did they renew the copyright registration on that newspaper. So there's a lot of searching that needs to be done. There's a lot of gray area that is involved there. And I have the link, I think, on the next slide to the Copyright Office where you can do a search. But just because you do a search in the copyright database online does not mean that that paper is going to show up in there, because they have not digitized all of the back copyright statements. So you still need to put in an in-person or a by-mail request to the Copyright Office in Washington, D.C. to have them do a thorough search to make sure that one wasn't missed in the digitization process. Now, what about papers since 1978? So any publication that's printed since 1978 is protected for 95 years from the date of publication. So if a newspaper comes out October 1st, 1978, it's protected for 95 years. Newspaper that comes out on today's date is protected for 95 years from the date of publication. So anything that you're going to want to reuse or republish after that date, you're definitely going to want to have in writing, not verbal, but in writing permission from that agency in order to use that particular item. You guys have these indexes available to you in your handout that you can download. You don't have to write them down. Copyright Office is listed at the top. That's where you can find out a little bit more about their statement on newspapers. There is not a copyright law written specifically for newspapers. Newspapers are just rolled into their textual copyrights when they're talking about businesses. Another thing to keep in mind with copyright, and here's one of those gray areas that hopefully the presenter will talk about on July 17th, is a lot of columnists for newspapers are contract for hire. So who owns the copyright to their individual articles? Is it the newspaper that owns the information, or is it the reporter, the columnist who owns the information, owns the copyright to that information? So it's worth it to investigate this copyright.gov link to find out a little bit more about their policy. Other really, really good explanations of copyright. Cornell University has an outstanding copyright center. I've included that link for you, as well as Stanford University also has a layman's guide to copyright in research. The Stanford guide, as well as the legal genealogist at the bottom, not only talks about copyright for newspapers for reproduction for libraries, but they also talk about use for individuals. So I'm a historian. I go out, I find a newspaper article, I download it to my computer, and then I want to use it in a research report, or I want to use it in a book that I'm publishing. They also talk about copyright standards for those individuals as well. So if you're reusing it for a Facebook, Throwback Thursday post, do you have the right to use it? And they talk about what's called fair use. And it's the ability to be able to use a segment of a publication, not the entire publication, but a portion of that to share, to inform and educate the public. So fair use standards are really, really important to understand. As librarians, we're familiar with it with interlibrary loans. Somebody comes in and they want us to send them an article out of the June 4th issue of, Women's Day. We have to checkmark a copyright statement in the interlibrary loan program in order to send that item. So it's that same kind of idea, just for the personal, the home, or the business use. So now what about outsourcing? I highly recommend outsourcing. As somebody who has done digitization projects, I find that the older I get, the less willing I am to sit and slog through 12,000 pages of newspaper text any longer. But if you have the ability to do it, you have volunteers and staff who are gung-ho and excited about digitizing themselves, then it's wonderful. It's extremely time-consuming. This could be a multi-year project for you. Whereas if I outsource the information, I can have that information back to me in a month or 2 months, and then I've got my project up and running. Obviously, it's much more expensive to do the outsourcing, but it also depends on what is your goal and who is your audience. Is your audience your teachers who are coming in for the August school year and they want to be able to have this information right away? Or it's a project that can take 2 years to complete and you can add a little at a time. So you need to figure out what your audience needs are and what your goals are. So if you're going to outsource, always interview a minimum of 3 vendors. There are plenty of digitization vendors out there. There are probably some in your own communities who would be willing to do this project for you. But you want to make sure that you're talking to multiple people. You want to make sure that you're getting RFPs, that they're giving you proposals that are understandable, because you'll find in the electronic world that sometimes people don't always talk in the technology world in a language that librarians can understand. So I need to have my IT guy explain a lot of things to me from time to time. Ask them for references. Tell them you want to see examples. Show me the work that you're proud of. Show me the things that were your favorite projects, that were your most successful projects. But then at the same time, go digging a little bit and see if you can find additional collections that they might have online. Contact those libraries and say, I hear that you worked with Veridian, or I hear that you've worked with, Internet Archive. How did it go? They're always going to put their best foot forward. So they're going to give you the projects that went well. See if you can find some of those collections that they don't mention and ask them their personal opinions. The best thing you can do, and we do this all the time as librarians, is we network. We network with other librarians and ask them, what do you think of this vendor? What do you think of this speaker? What do you think of this scanner, this equipment? And just test the waters and see what others have to say about that particular company. Don't take one negative review as meaning the company's not any good. We've all been on Yelp. We've all read those scandalous reviews of companies about how terrible they were to work with. Ask around, get a more rounded opinion of the individuals. But the types of things that you want to ask and the types of things you want to look for are those digitization standards. And I give you a link at the end of some examples of digitization projects standards, Library of Congress standards for what companies are expected to do, what libraries are expected to do. How are they going to be scanning these images? What types of file formats are they going to be using? What type of DPI are they using, which is dots per inch? The higher the DPI, the larger the file size, but the better quality of the item you're going to receive is as well. So you want to ask them these types of questions, and I'll point some of these out to some of the vendors that I'm going to mention in just a minute. Ask them to send you a free sample. You can send them a reel of microfilm, or you can send them an issue or two of your local paper and have them scan it for you and have them send that scan back to you so you could do a quality control on it. They are more than willing to do this for you because they'd like to have your business. So asking for them to send you a free sample is not out of bounds. And I think if they don't offer to send you one, if you forget to ask, then it might not be a company that you're going to put at the top of your list. There are a lot of digitization vendors out there. I only gave you a few as an example just to kind of keep us on track. There are big corporations out there that do this. You've got newspapers.com, you've got Newspaper Archive, you've got World Vital Records. There are a lot of big companies out there who are doing digitization. ProQuest is one that does a lot of digitization. But sometimes big companies aren't exactly what you need. Sometimes working with some of the smaller companies might be exactly where your library needs to go. And I've got some big companies in here, I've got some small companies in here to give you an idea of what's available. So if you've ever heard of Internet Archive, it's one of my absolute favorite websites. It was started by 2 hippies from California, and they will freely admit that. They have the entire Grateful Dead bootleg collection available on their website, as well as books, movies, microfilm, government documents, newspapers. They have millions and millions and millions of pages of items that have been digitized. A lot of them are out of copyright pre-1923, but they've also contracted with a lot of organizations, libraries, governmental bodies to digitize those items within copyright, that 1923 to 1978 timeframe as well. So there are a lot of books that have been made available to Internet Archive in that gray area up to 1924. But there's a lot of libraries that are using it to digitize their newspaper collections as well. Advantage Microfilm Company out of Iowa is another company I'll talk about. Veridian software is based overseas in Australia, but they have a lot of offices in the US. and then Crowley Company, which is based out of Frederick, Maryland. So if you've ever used Internet Archive, you're familiar with their platform. How they do their scanning, they work one-on-one with libraries, and they have regional representatives across the U.S. So our regional representative, his name is Jeff, is based out of Fort Wayne, Indiana, out of the Allen County Public Library, which is where his office is. So Internet Archive will digitize your collections for you, whether they are book collections, whether they are newspaper collections, whether they are image collections. And they have a reasonable fee and platform, which you can see here. So they originally scan material as JPEG 2000. So they are compressed. They're not non-compressed TIFFs, which is what in the preservation or archival world you would aim to strive for. But JPEG 2000 is a high resolution JPEG image that is sustainable. It is archival. So it'll last in the long run. They then take those JPEG images and they convert them into PDFs, and they run optical character recognition software on them. So they OCR them to create that searchable text. You can use one of two things. You can use MARC records or Dublin Core to provide the metadata. You provide all of the metadata to them, and then they take those MARC fields and they upload them into their software system. You can link directly to your library catalog. You can use the zip 39.50, but what they also require, if you're going to link to your catalog directly, so you're going to have, the Antioch newspaper available in your library card catalog with a link that takes them to Internet Archive. You'll provide them that Z39.50, but then they would also like to have an Excel spreadsheet that has the metadata in it as well as a backup. Their fees are reasonable depending on how much you're looking to digitize. So they have their setup fee, which I talked about earlier. Their setup fee is $3 per ID. So if you're doing 1 year of newspapers and you want them all to just be digitized together as a single item, then it'd be $3. But it wouldn't be very searchable. It wouldn't be very navigable. So, are you going to break it up by month? Are you going to break it up by issue? If you have a monthly newspaper, you have a weekly newspaper, it's more cost effective than if you have a daily newspaper. If you have a daily newspaper, then your setup fee could potentially be $3 per item. So $3 per issue that you're scanning. And then on top of that, this actual scanning cost would be 30 cents per page. And that's for your standard 11 by 17, 11 by 15 size page. If you go larger than that, some of those inserts, if some large broadsides that are 12 by 18, then it comes out to be $2.40 per page, which could be astronomical for some libraries. But if you're doing microfilm, it's already sized appropriately. So it would be the $3 setup fee per issue, but then it would only be 12 cents per page because they're all going to be consistent. So it'd be $12 per page. I'm sorry, 12 cents per page if you're sending them microfilm. So all of those prices include the hosting fee. So while it seems a little high, you'll hear some vendors who are coming in under that price tag. The reason why that cost is what it is because they're also going to host it on their website. And I'm going to show you what that website looks like and how you can use it. So if you go into Internet Archive and you do a search, I did a search on the St. Louis Argus, and it brings up the newspaper pages. When you're looking at digitized copies online, whether it's Illinois Digital Archives, whether it's Internet Archive, whomever the company is, you can tell the libraries that sent microfilm copies to the vendors because they're done in black and white. If the vendor is doing the scanning for you, in most instances, if you're sending loose newspapers into the company, they're going to be scanning them in grayscale or in color. So you can tell by looking at this image, the image is completely washed out. It's because of how it had originally been microfilmed. If you're doing original, you're going to get a much clearer, crisper image. So keep that in mind too. 90% of us, I think, our back issues of microfilm were just done in black and white. So this is the quality that you would be seeing. So you can view the issue, you can view the individual pages. If you click in the upper right-hand corner and you click on that magnifying glass, it'll take you into the text where you can do your search technology. They don't have what's called article segmentation. And what that means is each individual article is separated out as its own individual entry. Internet Archives does not offer that. So what they do is OCR technology, so you can search for the word you're looking for, and it'll show you the page in which that word exists. You can see all the different file formats in which you can download these files. So if you're uploading your collections, like Antioch did, their newspapers, into Internet Archives, people would be able to download those images in all of those formats that are provided on the right. So more than just the TIFFs or the JPEGs you're providing. So at the bottom of the screen, those little markers tell you exactly where the word Jones appears in that particular issue of the St. Louis Argus. The only downside I have to using Internet Archives for digitization is I circled Jones. Look at how faint that is. So if you're looking to find that text on that page, it's virtually impossible to identify. So if you're going to be uploading your newspaper collections, keep in mind that while they're doing OCR technology and they're reading these newspapers for you, the navigability of it, the ability to search it, could be hard for your patrons if the item is hard to find on the individual page. But it shows me when I search on Jones, the 3 points and where I can find it, and then it shows me what the text looks like so that I can find it easier on the page. OCR technology is great when you're working with modern newspapers, but if you're like my library and we digitized newspapers starting at 1977 and going forward, because we had the permission from our local newspaper to digitize our papers. So we've done mid-century papers, we've done more modern papers, which were done in grayscale. So they're really easy to read, and OCR technology works wonderful for that. But if you're scanning 19th century, early 20th century newspapers where it's a black and white microfilm from maybe a 50 or 75-year-old original copy that had already faded and was yellow, the OCR technology might not work very well because it's going to have a hard time reading that text because of font, because of quality, just because of the black and white of the original microfilm. So this is where you want to send a sample to these companies and see what kind of wonders they can work with those really early, poor quality microfilms. Advantage Preservation is the company that my library had contracted with to digitize our modern newspapers. I will tell you that they do a lot of small town newspaper collections. They are reasonably priced, they are friendly, they are easy to work with. I personally am not impressed with the quality or the searchability of the information that we have available through them. And I'll talk about that in a second. So Advantage Preservation Company will digitize your files for you. They digitize them at 300 DPI, which is standard for publication. When you buy a book off the shelf, it's typically done at 300 DPI. They do theirs in black and white. They don't do them in grayscale. So I lose the ability to get nice, clear, crisp images out of my newspapers because there's too much contrast there. So they'll do an entire reel. They'll digitize an entire reel for you for $95, which is a great price, and it's a great starting point. They'll create a website for you. They host a series of small town newspaper, and that link is on the next slide. I believe I'll point that out to you. They'll create the website for you for $500. They'll host it for you, and there's no cost for the hosting. So if you add 5 years, and then you want to add another 5 years, and then another 5 years, they're not going to charge you more for that. You've already paid the platform fee. They will also, if you ask for it, provide you an external drive containing all of the scanned images. So if you do 50 years of newspapers, they'll put them on an external drive and they will send them to you. My problem with the copy of the external drive that they sent me is that my files are not saved in numerical or chronological order. So the file names and numbers don't match up with the individual issues. So it's pretty useless for me to go and pull data off of the individual drives by issue because they're not sequenced that way. They're not sequenced by name, they're not sequenced by date. But if you really just want them to host and you're not necessarily interested in the external drive so that you can use the data yourself, then it's a really good, inexpensive option for libraries. And if you want more information, I put the bit.ly link in there for you to find out more. Here's the quality of the papers. We sent originals as well as microfilm. This was one of the originals that we sent to them. The quality is not bad. It's easily OCR readable. The problem is I lose those images. So, you know, as an archivist, I want to be able to see the images. I can see that Mayor Richard Selfridge is in this image, but I can't really see him just because of the quality of the paper. But at the bottom, there's a gentleman who writes a blog called The Ancestor Hunt, and he put together a nice little list, and he updates it about once a year of all of the Advantage Preservation newspaper collections that they've digitized and made available online. So go out to this link and test drive and take a look at the quality and the searchability of the materials that they have available online. So now Veridian, we went from a small company to a huge company. So Veridian is a very large company, and they host and make available newspaper collections online for states, for universities, for consortia. So Veridian isn't a company that you are going to use as an individual library, but it is something that you could consider as a consortia, or the Illinois Digital Newspaper Project, which I'll talk about in a little bit, works with Veridian to digitize newspapers and make them available across the state of Illinois, and you would be able to get in on that as well. Veridian doesn't do the scanning themselves. They prefer to use local vendors for digitization, and they will give you recommendations if you contact them. They will give you the names of companies in your area, and the reason being is because they don't want you to send them your original copies of newspapers all the way to Australia. You know, they'll take your microfilm and they'll be able to scan the microfilm, but it would be cost ineffective for you to send originals to them. So they recommend scanners in your home area that you can contract with. And because of that, the rate can change dramatically based on what the local rates are in your area. But the standards that they set for their third-party vendors, their scanners that they use, are that the items need to be scanned as TIFF images. They need to be non-compressed TIFF images. They set their standard at 300 DPI, but if you ask for it, they will do 400 and up to 600 DPI for you, depending on how you're going to use these collections. They then take those images just like Internet Archive does, and they convert those into searchable PDFs so that they're accessible to you. They do the cleanup of the images, they do the deskewing, they do the cropping, and they get the images all set. You pay about 10 cents per page for them to do all of that work. And then if you're interested, they do what is called article segmentation, which means they will go in and separate out with a human. They can't do it with technology, which is why it can cost a lot depending on how many papers you have. And they will go through and a human will look at every issue and they will crop out and segment out every one of those newspaper articles to make it easier to search for you. So those newspapers where the quality is not good, OCR isn't working great because it just can't read, there's not enough contrast, article segmentation can be your best friend for those papers. Now their costs range because it depends on the third-party vendors that they're using, but they offer what's called a perpetual licensing of their software. So their fee would be $10,000 up front. And I know half of you probably swooned, because I swooned when I first saw it, but that $10,000 is typically being paid by a consortium, a university that has the budget for that. And then that gives you license to use their software to upload your data anytime you'd like going forward. They also offer, you know, a package for a pay-as-you-go. It's called SaaS, software services, where you can pay the one-time setup fee and then an annual hosting fee. So you're paying that hosting fee every year as you go along. So while it seems like a lot of money, the work that they do is really, really the best in the field that you can get. So if you're part of a consortium, it's worth discussing among your libraries. But if you're an individual library and you just want to be able to get your collections online, I'll talk about the Illinois Digital Newspaper Project in a second. So here's what that article segmentation looks like. So if you go to their website, I pulled up some of their Hawaiian. They have a huge Hawaiian newspaper collection. And off to the side on the left, you see each individual newspaper article already segmented out. Somebody has read that So it's not OCR. Somebody has read that to make sure that it's accurate. So you're going to get a much deeper, more granular, better search by article segmentation than just an OCR of text for an entire volume or an entire issue. And then you can click on each individual article and it highlights it within the text so you can find it. They also give you the ability to print, to save, to share. So there's a lot of options with Veridian. They also offer a website that's called Elefind, which for the individual user is a great way to find information online. So if I'm a patron and I'm coming into your library and I want to look at your digital newspapers anywhere in the world, let's say I'm on vacation in Myrtle Beach and I want to look at your collections, I can go into Elefind and see all of the newspapers that Veridian has digitized around the world, and I have access to that for free from wherever I am. So it's really a great platform for the end user, for your patrons, and for your genealogists to be able to go in and access this information. And you can see some of these collections: Michigan, Colorado, Illinois, Pennsylvania. So a lot of states are working with them. Now, Crowley Company. I haven't worked with Crowley Company personally, but I have very good friends who work at the Beaird Arts Public Library in Frederick, Maryland, and they rave about this company and how friendly they are and how much they're willing to do for you outside of your original project. And I have talked with Crowley Company. They'll scan your images. They'll give you a free sample. They're very willing to show you their work up front. They scan all of their images as grayscale, as TIFF files. You can request JPEGs if you would like them, but their baseline is 400 dpi grayscale TIFF, which is perfect for archival purposes. They also run the OCR software, create the PDFs for you. They can do the article segmentation where they break those articles out for you as well at an extra cost. If you are sending them microfilm reels, they could be as low as 3 cents per image based on the quality of the microfilm that you're submitting. If you're sending original hard copies, then the price starts at 50 cents. And the reason being is because they manually have to handle those original documents. So they're a wonderful company. They're an archival preservation company. They've won awards several years in a row, but they don't host digital images. So if you're going to use them to do your scanning, then you would want to use another vendor like Internet Archive, like Veridian, or like the next two I'm going to talk about, Ida, Illinois, and Illinois Digital Newspaper Project, as the host for that collection. So Illinois Digital Newspaper Project, they use Veridian software. They work solely on grants that they receive from the state library, that they receive from the federal government. They work on 2-year grant cycles. And William, the person who's in charge of the Digital Newspaper Project, said that their goal every 2 years is to digitize 100,000 pages of Illinois newspapers. And that includes the process of the OCR technology, the skewing, the correcting, all of that back-end work that needs to go into that project. They already have Veridian software, so they're willing to accept your collections. So if you decide you're going to do in-house scanning, or you decide you're going to use a third-person vendor, the Illinois Digital Newspaper Project is happy to host your collection at no cost. And they're happy to work with you through that process of getting that information uploaded and available into the Illinois Digital Newspaper products. So the link that they use for their standards is through the Library of Congress, because they're part of the Digital Newspaper Project through the Library of Congress. The Illinois Digital Newspaper Project is uploaded into Chronicling America if you have ever used it. So that's the platform that they use. So it goes to a global audience. So you're being able to be discovered, your discoverability goes up because you're being part of the Library of Congress's platform. The Illinois Digital Archives, Ida, Illinois, also hosts digitization projects as well, not just newspapers. The Plainfield Public Library has several collections up and available through Ida, Illinois. They also will do the hosting for you. They don't do the digitization. They rely on you to find a vendor or do the in-house scanning yourself. They use Content DM as their metadata, and they would provide you with the license for Content DM if you're interested in uploading your collections into the Illinois Digital Archive. They have OCR technology, so you can do an OCR search on it. They do transcription, not segmentation. So you would upload the transcription file, the Word document, the Excel spreadsheet that you've created for that individual item. But the company itself, Illinois Digital Archives, which is sponsored by the Illinois State Library, does not do article segmentation. They do have a wider range of discoverability, well beyond just using IDA Illinois, because IDA Illinois collections have been uploaded into OCLC, and they've also been uploaded into the Digital Public Library of America website as well. So you would have discoverability through those two avenues as well as IDA Illinois. So both are great free options for you once you've gotten your collections digitized to then host them locally through an Illinois site that has global reach. So if you want to find out more information about what the standards are, what types of technology, what types of information do you need to have to begin your project, I gave you some great information, some great websites here. You know, the state of Michigan, we saw that they have their collections in Veridian. This gives you their guidelines and standards for how they conduct their projects. You know, you have the Center for Research Libraries at the bottom, which is the Center for Research Libraries based out of the University of Chicago in Hyde Park. So you have a lot of different options available to you to get you started. So why do we do this? Why do we digitize our papers? Because we want them to have them available to a broader audience. We want them to be accessible globally. We want people to be able to have access to them regardless of where they are, so they're not tied to the library. And we want to be able to get our library's name out there into the world so people realize that we have services that can benefit them, even if they're not physically within our buildings. So in your handout, you have the contact information for the companies that I talked about. I did not include it in my slides because I didn't want to put their personal emails out there on the web globally, but you have them as the last page of your slide. So feel free to contact any of those companies. You'll be able to have access to that information directly, and then ask me. My email, my contact information is on there. I'm more than happy to answer specific questions that you might have about the project. As somebody who has been there and who has done that, you know, I can offer a little bit of insight into what you can do as well. But again, contact William at the Illinois Digital Newspaper Projects. You know, contact the State Library, the IDA Illinois contact, and ask them how you can participate in their programs. So thank you for being here today. I'm amazed and happy that I could keep it to an hour, which some of you know I have a very hard time doing. But I'm happy to answer any questions that you have too.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Tina. That was really helpful. We do have plenty of time for questions. I've got a couple here that I will read out loud, but if you've thought of anything else, please send those in. So first question, when outsourcing, how reliable is a company when handling irreplaceable materials? Do libraries need to have insurance on the materials they send out?
Well, the company itself should have liability insurance. So the company would be responsible if they happen to damage things. But again, it all goes back to asking for references and looking at reviews of the company. Contact the Better Business Bureau. Companies who have been doing this longer, companies who are dedicated to preservation, they have preservation in their title, I'm a little more likely to contact and ask questions of. Again, asking libraries who have used their services, because any company can give you a sales pitch. Any company can tell you that they're the best thing since sliced bread. And of course, they're going to give you their 3 top projects that they've worked on. That's why you go and you search out those other projects that they don't brag about and ask why. You know, why didn't they make it to the top of their list, and find out. One company that I did not put in the handout because they don't do hosting is Northern Micrographics, which is a company based out of La Crosse, Wisconsin. It's a manageable drive for a lot of us. They do amazing digitization work. They just don't do hosting. So I didn't include them in this particular presentation. But you know, you go back and you look at, every website should have on its link a link to their best practices and standards. Who do they follow? Do they follow the Library of Congress? Do they follow the METS form of metadata construction? You know, what are they using? And they should be able to tell you all of that. And if you don't find that information on their website, if it's not easily accessible, then I would probably put them lower in my list. But it couldn't hurt to have insurance, especially if you are mailing things, because you can't always count on UPS or the post office or FedEx to be delicate with your items. So if I was going to insure anything, it would be for that process. But ask the company if they offer insurance in case something gets damaged.
All right. Terrific. I've got a whole bunch of questions here, so
okay.
We'll just keep going. One library is looking to partner with Ancestry to digitize over 400 rolls of newspaper on microfilm. There's no charge to the library, but search is available in-house only. Have you had any experience with something like this? I
have, and I don't include Ancestry in my presentation for a lot of reasons. So you're more than welcome to email me, and I'll give you the skinny on it. I'll give you an example. Ancestry digitized the Lockport Area Genealogical and Historical Society's collections. They did 64 collections for them. They uploaded them online. They gave Lockport a free link so that people could access those collections. And you can negotiate. Lockport negotiated that those collections would be free and not behind a paywall. When Ancestry updated their platform, those links disappeared. And Lockport had no access to their digital images for 18 months. So I am not a big fan of Ancestry for a number of reasons, but Ancestry owns your images. They live on their site. If their site has a problem, you don't have access. And I have a problem with that as an archivist and personally as a genealogist. So Ancestry would not be even in my top 10 list of companies to work with. And it's terrible to say because we're being recorded.
All right. Next question. If you don't have copyright permission, can you still digitize and keep the files for backup or future use?
That's that gray area that runs into the fair use policy. I'm sure the lecture on the 17th is going to go way into more detail about that. Do you not have permission because you haven't asked? Do you not have permission because the owner said no? Or do you not have permission because the company has since gone out of business? So, you know, assess what your options are. You can make a digital copy of an image and have it for preservation purposes, but how you make that available is where that gray area comes in. Do you only have it available on a CD-ROM that's available to patrons who come in and ask for it? As soon as you put it on a digital platform, then there's the potential for sale or, you know, reuse outside of that fair use policy. So having a link to your website where people can access it remotely violates that fair use policy.
All right. For newspapers that have some color spreads, would the standard still be grayscale for the entire issue?
Yes, the standard is typically grayscale, but there are companies who will scan in color if you ask for it. So Northern Micrographics will scan in color if you ask for it. Crowley Company will scan in color if you ask for it. Internet Archives only does grayscale. Advantage only does a black and white. So if you do want to make sure that you have those available in color, then you're going to want to contact one of those companies that can handle that type of equipment. But again, you're going to pay a premium for the fact that it's in color.
Is the cost increased because of the file size? And
the file size is bigger, and there's more involved with color issues versus grayscale.
Interesting. Couple more questions here. Any thoughts about using digital microfilm readers such as ScanPro 1100 to create a searchable newspaper database?
I have ScanPro, and I've tried to use it, but it is so time consuming. It is basically the exact same thing as if you were scanning the originals yourself. So yes, you can do it in-house. It's expensive, I mean, but you absolutely can do it. Article segmentation gets a bit wonky when you're trying to do it using ScanPro, but it absolutely can be done. But it puts the onus on you to do that individual page correction, you know, that color correction, that skew correction. But absolutely, if you're willing to do it, then it is certainly a serviceable option for you.
What about cut out articles that don't have any identifiers? Are these okay to scan and include on a digital collection?
It is the same. I think every one of us can relate. We all have scrapbook, you know, individual clippings files. Those are still under copyright. So even if it's an individual clipping and not the entire page, it's still under copyright in the sense that, is it the columnist that has the copyright, or is it the paper that has the copyright? So you still need to ask the newspaper's permission in order to make those available online. I'll give you an example. So about 10 years ago, when I wrote my first grant, we contacted the Plainfield Enterprise, who was still family owned at the time, and said, we have a newspaper clippings file for the Second World War. It was newspaper clippings of, soldiers' weddings, furloughs, articles, letters written home during the Second World War period. And we contacted them and said, can we digitize these individual clippings and make them available on our website? And the family said no. They said, they still own the copyright and that they didn't want the library benefiting from their for-profit organization. Fast forward 8 years, the Plainfield Enterprise has been sold. It is now owned by a private company. We contacted them again about digitizing the entire newspaper and not just the clippings file, and they were thrilled. They were excited at the option to be able to digitally access, as long as they got a copy, an external drive as well for them. So sometimes, it's all just about asking, and if they said no once, ask them again. But those clippings files are still owned and are still under the copyright of the original organization if you're doing them in mass. If you're doing an individual image here and there as part of a promotion for a program or a Facebook post or something like that, then it falls under fair use. But if you're doing them in mass, then it's outside of that fair use policy.
All right. A follow-up to that is, this library doesn't know which newspapers these clippings came from. So how do you manage that?
Well, you could try a crowdsourcing project. So our library has a Flickr account where we post historic images as well as images from modern day programs. If you're not uploading all of them at once, you're still within fair use. If you're just, because you're putting it out there asking for help. We have this newspaper clipping. Does anybody know what paper this could have come from? And there are plenty of historians and people out there who can identify newspaper clippings by the header and the font that's used. And it doesn't hurt to compare it to the papers from that era. Print off a copy of the paper from that year or that decade and start comparing it to see if you can match it up. Or look through a genealogy website, Family Search, Internet Archives, Ancestry, to see if somebody has posted an obit, a transcription of that obit that would match. But it's tough. I mean, it's really tough.
And along those lines, another follow-up, some of these clippings have handwritten notes that do identify the newspaper. How would you handle that with digitizing? Would you digitize the notes?
Absolutely. Absolutely, I would include the notes in. Again, it goes back to what your goals are and what your purpose. Who is your audience? So as an archivist, I scan an entire image so that you can see the border of the page. I don't crop it so that you're not seeing the edge. And the reason being is because what if something's written there? And that could be pertinent to somebody's research. By digitizing the whole thing, including the handwritten notes, that handwritten note could be important to somebody if that's their grandmother's handwriting. Or you never know. So digitizing the entire image and making sure you're keeping that also helps you identify the object as well. And it kind of changes copyright a little bit because it's changing the published work. Somebody writes a novel, but then somebody goes and makes changes to it, rewrites it, does whatever, then that changes the copyright. So it'll be interesting to hear what the program in July talks about that, how it alters the original artifact.
All right, I just have two more questions. Libraries have been using microfilm to archive their newspapers forever now. How practical is it to switch to digital preservation instead of microfilm for newspaper collections moving forward?
Part of the problem is the fact that there aren't enough microfilm companies making microfilm to make it a viable option for much longer. I still get a microfilm copy of my newspaper every year, and the reason being is because if the power goes out, I can still hold it up and have a physical object to which I can copy. Digital, there are lots of organizations that have what are called born digital files, which means they've never lived in a physical format. They've only ever been digital. And there are ways to preserve those and archive those. And there are standards that are set both from the Image Permanence Institute as well as the Library of Congress as well as the National Archives. There are lots of standards that are set on born digital items. It really is your comfort level. I tell people all the time that, because I teach a lot of genealogy classes around Illinois, and I always tell people it's great to have a digital copy, but make a printout of it. Because if your hard drive fails, your server crashes, your building, you know, has storm damage and all the technology is underwater, you know, digital copies are just as precarious as print copies. So having some type of redundant system benefits you in the long run. So keep microfilm, in my opinion, keep microfilm as long as you can still get it and it's still cost effective. But at some point, we're all going to feel that switch.
Good question. And then the last one, I can partially answer, then maybe you can add on some thoughts. But somebody asked if there are consultants available that can help with projects, and I don't know how much assistance that you need, but I'll just mention that Rails does have a consultants directory on our website that everyone can access. You just need to log in with your L2 username and password. I'm posting the link into the chat box now, so you can have that. Offhand, you know, I'd have to look and see how many might work on digital projects. I know we have a partnership with Lyrasis, who does do some advising, and I'm not sure how deep their assistance goes, but they also have training as well.
They have great training.
Yeah.
They have outstanding. They do a digitization workshop that the Illinois State Archives will offer free. You know, it's first come, first serve, but they usually do about 25 people for their digitization basics workshop. Look for that in the fall because it's outstanding.
So yeah, they do excellent training. As far as, and I know being a member of Rails, you get some discounts on things through Lyrasis, but I would check the consultants directory. I don't know, Tina, if you have anything to add to that. Well, somebody who needs help with their project.
Yeah, the last two that I mentioned, the Illinois Digital Archives and the Illinois Digital Newspaper Projects, both of those are more than happy to sit down and work with individual libraries, assessing their needs, helping them get their items scanned, who can they go to, you know, who would they'll recommend people for you, as well as helping you go through that end user process of getting the metadata uploaded, getting the files added to the internet, and getting all of that up and running. So both of those organizations can be really, really helpful in your project going forward.
Awesome. Well, that's all the questions we have. Thank you, Tina, for your time and your expertise. It was really interesting.
Thank you.
Tina knows back in the day I used to do microfilming of newspapers. Digitizing was just getting off the ground back then, so it's been really interesting to hear what libraries are doing today. And if you're thinking about a project or you're working on a project now, I wish you good luck. And you know, thank you all for joining us today. As I mentioned earlier, this session was recorded, so I'll get that posted on the Rails website shortly, and I will send you an email when it's ready. And any parting thoughts, Tina?
Take advantage of grant opportunities that are out there. That's the #1 thing that you can do. You know, it can be cost prohibitive for a lot of us to do that scanning or doing that outsourcing. I had just received one of the state library digitization grants, so we're going to be sending all of our oversized maps to Northern Micrographics in Wisconsin to be digitized. You know, there's funding out there. You know, Walmart offers money, Target offers money, Meijer offers money for local projects. Hamburger Helper every once in a while does a grant where they offer money to communities. So it doesn't always have to be, you know, endowment for the arts, endowment for the humanities, the state library. You know, there are lots of little organizations that are just dying to give money away. So it's worth it to just try to investigate what's in your area, what's in your state. So have your elevator pitch of what you want to accomplish, and then go out there and ask them for it.
All right. All right, well, thanks again, Tina, and thank you all for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Bye.